Kicked out at 74 with nothing, she got a letter about a farm her mother never mentioned. If you've ever felt like the world has forgotten you, stick around. This story is for you. And if it resonates, consider subscribing, because we tell stories for people who know what it feels like to start over. The door to Golden Pastures Senior Living clicked shut behind me with an antiseptic finality. It wasn't a slam, nothing that dramatic. It was a clean, quiet, mechanical sound. The sound of a file being closed, a page being turned by a hand that was not my own. For 12 years, that sound had meant security, the locking away of the outside world. Now, it was locking me out. I stood on the pristine concrete walkway, the November air biting at my cheeks with a cold, impersonal malice. To my right was a perfectly manicured lawn, unnaturally green for the season, glistening with a morning frost that looked like a layer of sugar on a stale cake. To my left, a single metal bench, painted a cheerful but ultimately insulting shade of blue. I had one suitcase, a worn, gray fabric thing whose wheels wobbled, and a canvas tote bag heavy with the few administrative odds and ends of a life being summarily dismantled. 74 years old, and my entire existence had been condensed into what I could carry in two hands. The facility's new owners, a corporate entity with a name full of optimistic, meaningless words like synergy and lifestyle, had been ruthlessly efficient. They'd bought the property, announced its closure for a luxury redevelopment, and given us 60 days. 60 days to unravel decades of life. Some residents had family to take them in. Others were transferred to sister facilities, shuffled around the system like so many playing cards. I, however, had slipped through the cracks. No family left to call. My pension, which had been just enough to cover my board at Golden Pastures, was not enough for the newer, shinier places. So, I was given a list of shelters, a final check for the balance of the month, and a professionally sympathetic smile from a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. She had called me Hun. The word had hung in the air between us, a flimsy bridge over a chasm of misunderstanding. I sat down on the cold blue bench. The bus wasn't due for another 20 minutes. I watched a leaf skitter across the asphalt of the parking lot, a frantic, pointless dance against the wind. I felt a kinship with it, uprooted, brittle, and at the mercy of forces I couldn't see or comprehend. I clutched the handle of my suitcase, my knuckles white. Inside were 3 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book I'd read 100 times, a small photo album, and my mother's old silver locket. Not much to show for a lifetime, but they were mine. The tote bag held the real weight, not in pounds, but in significance. It held the paperwork of my termination, the sterile documents that declared my residency complete, my birth certificate, my social security card, and a small stack of mail that the front desk had handed me on my way out, a final, mundane act of severance. I refused to look at it, not yet. To do so would be to admit that this was real, that the room I had slept in last night, with its view of the weeping willow, was already being stripped, its memory of me erased. I focused on the smell of the air instead. It was different out here. It smelled of damp earth and distant wood smoke, a raw, honest smell that was a world away from the facility's perpetual scent of lemon-scented cleaner and lukewarm soup. For 12 years, my world had been climate-controlled and predictable. Now, I could feel the dampness seeping into my thin coat. I could feel the hard metal of the bench through my slacks. I was no longer observing the world through a double-paned window. I was in it. And it was cold. A car pulled up to the entrance, a family arriving to visit someone who still belonged. A woman got out, holding a bouquet of flowers. She glanced at me, her expression a quick, uncomfortable flicker of pity before she hurried inside. I had become invisible in a new way. Before, I was just an old woman, part of the scenery. Now, I was a problem. A piece of social awkwardness to be looked away from. I pulled my coat tighter. The bus was late. The city bus sighed to a stop, its brakes hissing like a tired animal. I wrestled my suitcase aboard, the driver watching with an impassive stare. He didn't offer to help. I didn't expect him to. I found a seat near the back, a plastic shell that was cracked and cold. The bus lurched forward, and I watched Golden Pastures shrink in the window until it was just another brick building on a street of brick buildings. Gone. I rode for an hour, through neighborhoods that shifted from tidy suburbs to gritty industrial parks, and then to the dense, anonymous heart of the city. I got off 3 blocks from the address on the shelter pamphlet. The walk was the hardest part. The wobbly wheel on my suitcase caught in every crack in the sidewalk, jarring my arm. People flowed around me, a river of purpose and intention, while I felt like a piece of driftwood, aimless and waterlogged. The shelter was clean but crowded. The air was thick with the silent desperation of 100 different stories of loss. I was assigned a cot in a large room with 20 other women. The woman on the cot next to me was young enough to be my granddaughter, her face pale and drawn. We didn't speak. There was an unspoken rule in places like this. You respected the privacy of another person's pain. I tucked my suitcase under my cot and kept my tote bag close, my hand resting on it as if it were a living thing. That night, sleep was a shallow, restless sea. Every cough, every sigh, every distant siren was a reminder of where I was. I was used to the curated silence of Golden Pastures, broken only by the gentle hum of the building's ventilation. This was the sound of unfiltered life, and it was terrifying. In the morning, I found a small common area with a few rickety tables. I bought a cup of weak coffee from a vending machine and sat down, finally ready to face the mail. It was mostly junk. A final bill from the facility, which I knew I couldn't pay. An advertisement for a walk-in bathtub. And then, at the bottom of the pile, a thick, cream-colored envelope. It felt heavy, important. The return address was for a law firm, Finch and Associates. The name meant nothing to me. It had been forwarded from my old address, a sticker plastered over the original typing. My name, Elara Vance, was printed in crisp black ink. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it open. The paper inside was just as heavy, with a formal letterhead. I put on the reading glasses I kept in my coat pocket and began to read. The language was dense, full of legal terms that swam before my eyes. Pursuant to the estate of Iris Vance. My mother. My heart gave a painful lurch. My mother had been gone for 40 years. She had died of pneumonia when I was in my 30s, leaving me with little more than a box of photographs and a deep, abiding sense of absence. We had always been poor, moving from one small city apartment to another. There was no estate. There was nothing. I kept reading, my confusion mounting. We are writing to inform you that you have been identified as the sole living heir to the property known as Blackwood Farm, located in the township of North Haven, Vermont. Vermont? I had never been to Vermont. My mother had never spoken of Vermont. She had been a city person through and through, terrified of spiders and wide open spaces. This had to be a mistake. A cruel, bureaucratic error. The letter went on. It spoke of a trust, established in 1950, the year I was born. It spoke of the property lying dormant for decades. And then it got to the point. The reason for this correspondence is twofold. First, the property has accrued significant delinquent tax liabilities amounting to $34,000. Second, we have received a formal offer to purchase the property from the Northwood Development Group for the sum of $100,000. My breath caught in my throat. $100,000. It was an impossible number, a figure from another universe. The letter explained that the sale would comfortably cover the back taxes and all legal fees, leaving a net sum to be dispersed to me. Should you wish to accept this offer, please sign the enclosed documents. Alternatively, should you wish to retain the property, the outstanding tax liability must be settled with the town of North Haven before the deadline of January 31st. That was less than 2 months away. I stared at the letter, my mind a whirlwind of disbelief and suspicion. A farm. A secret farm. An offer that could solve all my immediate problems. It felt like a dream, or more likely, a sophisticated scam designed to prey on the desperate. But the paper felt too real. The letterhead was embossed. I ran my thumb over the raised letters of the law firm's name. Finch, Finch and Associates. A thought surfaced, a memory faint as a watercolor. My mother, humming in our small kitchen, looking at a letter. "Mr. Finch is a good man," she had said once, to no one in particular. An honest man. I had been a child. I'd forgotten it until this very moment. A tiny, fragile seed of possibility began to sprout in the barren soil of my despair. What if it was real? What if, all this time, there had been a piece of my mother, a piece of my life, waiting for me in a place I'd never known? I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, my hand shaking no longer from fear, but from something else entirely, something that might have been hope. The next morning, I found a payphone in the shelter's lobby that still worked. My fingers were stiff with cold as I fed it the coins I'd carefully counted out. I dialed the number on the letterhead. The phone rang 3 times, then a calm, male voice answered. "Finch and Associates." "I'm calling for a Mr. Alistair Finch," I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "This is he." "My name is Alara Vance. I received a letter from you." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of papers shuffling. "Ah, yes, Ms. Vance. I was hoping you'd call. I confess, you were not an easy person to locate." His voice was exactly as I had imagined, professional, measured, and devoid of any overt emotion. It was the voice of someone who dealt in facts, not feelings. "I don't understand," I said, getting straight to the point. "My mother, she never owned a farm. We never had anything." "I understand your confusion," he said patiently. "The property was purchased by your mother, Iris Vance, in April of 1950. She placed it into a rather complex trust, with my father, the original Mr. Finch, as the trustee. The instructions were specific. The trust was to remain dormant, its existence undisclosed, unless certain conditions were met. One of them was a forced sale due to tax delinquency. The recent offer from Northwood Development triggered our obligation to find you. My father, he had handled my mother's affairs. It was the same firm. The memory wasn't a phantom. "So, this is real," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "It is very real, Ms. Vance, as is the tax bill, and the offer." "The offer," I repeated. The number still felt unreal. $100,000. After the taxes and fees, what would be left? "Approximately $55,000 to $60,000, he replied, his tone matter of fact. "A substantial sum." Substantial. To him, perhaps. To me, it was a lifeline. It was the difference between a cot in a shelter and a small, clean room in a place like Golden Pastures, but with the rent paid for the rest of my probable life. It was safety. It was an end to the fear. All I had to do was sign a paper. It was the sensible thing to do. The only thing to do. "And if I don't sell?" I asked, the question feeling foolish as soon as it left my lips. "If you don't sell, you will be responsible for the $34,000 tax bill. The town of North Haven has already initiated foreclosure proceedings. The deadline is firm. If the taxes aren't paid, the property will go to auction." The choice was clear. An illusion of a choice, really. Take the money and secure a quiet end to my life. Or chase a fantasy and end up with nothing at all. "I see," I said softly. "Mr. Finch, this farm, what is it like?" There was another pause. "I have the file in front of me," he said. "It's 110 acres, mostly wooded, some pasture land. There is a main farmhouse, a barn, and a few smaller outbuildings. According to the last assessment, done decades ago, The structures were in fair condition. I can't speak to their current state. It hasn't been inhabited since your mother left it. He left it unsaid, but the implication was clear. It was likely a ruin, a ghost of a place. I'm sending you a packet with copies of the deed, the trust documents, and a key to the front door of the house, he continued. I suggest you review the developer's offer. It's a fair market price for undeveloped land in that area. It's a good offer, Ms. Vance. I knew he was right. I knew I should be grateful. But something in me resisted, a stubborn, illogical knot of defiance. My mother had bought a farm. My mother, who was afraid of the dark and lived her life in 2 small rooms in the city, had secretly owned 110 acres of Vermont. Why? The question echoed in the empty spaces of my heart. It was a mystery she had left behind, and the $60,000 felt like a cheap price for ignoring it. I want to see it, I said, the decision solidifying as I spoke the words. Ms. Vance, I'm not sure that's wise. It's a long way, and winter in Vermont can be. I want to see it, I repeated, a firmness in my voice that surprised even me. Mr. Finch was silent for a moment. I could almost hear him mentally shrugging. As you wish. The key will be in the packet. It should arrive at the address I have for you in a day or 2. He meant the shelter. The finality of it stung. Thank you, Mr. Finch, I said, and hung up before he could offer any more sensible advice. The decision was made. I went back to my cot and took stock of my finances. I had a little over $400 left from my final check. It was supposed to last me until my next pension payment. I spent the afternoon at the public library, looking up bus routes. A one-way ticket to White River Junction, the closest major stop to North Haven, was $217. It was a reckless, foolish expense. It was everything I had. But as I paid for the ticket online, using the library's slow computer, I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. I was no longer drifting, I was moving toward something. 2 days later, the packet from Mr. Finch arrived. I held the key in my palm. It was an old-fashioned skeleton key, heavy and ornate. It felt less like a piece of metal and more like a question. That afternoon, I boarded a bus heading north, my suitcase in the luggage bay, my tote bag on my lap. As the bus pulled out of the city, I watched the familiar skyline, with its canyons of glass and steel, recede into the gray winter haze. I was leaving the only world I had ever known, heading toward a place that shouldn't exist, a memory that wasn't mine. The journey took 9 hours. I watched the landscape transform, the urban sprawl giving way to rolling hills, then to mountains dusted with the first hints of serious snow. The other passengers were a quiet mix of college students and families. No one paid me any mind. I was just an old woman on a bus, staring out the window. But inside, I felt like an explorer, charting a course into the blank spaces on my own map. I was going home to a place I'd never been. The bus arrived in White River Junction well after dark. The station was small and cold, smelling of diesel fumes and wet wool. North Haven, the final destination, was another 20 miles away, a tiny dot on the map with no bus service. I had planned to spend the night in the station, to wait until morning, but the hard plastic chairs and the flickering fluorescent lights felt too much like a different kind of waiting room. I wanted to be there. Now. I saw a single taxi idling by the curb, its light on. The driver was a large man with a thick, gray beard, reading a newspaper under the dome light. I tapped on his window. He lowered it, a cloud of warm air escaping into the night. "Need a ride?" he grumbled, his eyes scanning my suitcase and my tired face. "How much to North Haven?" I asked. He named a price that made my stomach clench. It was nearly all the money I had left. I hesitated for only a second. "All right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He got out and heaved my suitcase into the trunk with a grunt. The ride was silent for the first few miles. The road climbed out of the small city and into darkness. There were no streetlights here, only the twin beams of the headlights cutting a tunnel through a forest of black, skeletal trees. "You from around here?" the driver finally asked, his voice less gruff now. "No," I said. "I'm visiting family property." It felt strange to say the words out loud. "North Haven, huh? Not much out there. What property would that be?" "It's called Blackwood Farm." The driver shot me a quick look. "Blackwood Farm? Haven't heard that name in years. That's the old Iris place. Been empty as long as I can remember. Folks say it's haunted." "Iris was my mother," I said quietly. The driver, whose name I learned was George, fell silent again. But it was a different kind of silence, a respectful one. "Well, I'll be," he said after a while. "World's a funny place." We turned off the main road onto a smaller, unpaved one. The taxi bounced and jostled. Finally, George slowed the car and pointed. "There's the driveway. Can't take you up it. It'll be a mess of snow and mud. I can help you with your bag to the start of it, though." He pulled over. The air that hit me when I opened the door was so cold it felt solid. It smelled of pine and snow and frozen earth. It was the cleanest air I had ever breathed. George helped me with my suitcase, setting it down at the entrance to a long, dark path, flanked by 2 crumbling stone pillars. "House is about a quarter-mile in," he said. "You sure you're all right? Got a phone? Cell service is spotty out here." "I'll be fine," I lied. I paid him, leaving myself with less than $20. He hesitated, then pushed a few bills back into my hand. "For a cup of coffee in the morning," he said. "The general store in town opens at 7. If you need anything, ask for Mary. Just tell her George sent you." He got back in his car, and with a final, worried look, he drove away, his taillights disappearing into the oppressive dark. I was alone. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind in the pines and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I stood before the driveway, which was more of a forgotten track, covered in a thin, crisp layer of snow. I could just make out the dark shape of the house in the distance, a silhouette against a sky brilliant with stars I had never seen in the city. It looked like a slumbering beast. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my suitcase handle and started walking. The wobbly wheel was useless here. I half dragged, half carried it, the tote bag slung over my other shoulder. The walk was grueling. The cold seeped through my coat, and my breath plumed in front of me. With every step, I felt the foolhardiness of my decision. I was a 74-year-old woman, alone in the woods, in the middle of the night, with no food and no heat, walking toward a house that might be ready to collapse. But I kept going. I was drawn forward by a force I couldn't name. Finally, I reached it. The farmhouse was larger than I had imagined. A classic 2-story colonial with a wide front porch. In the moonlight, I could see the peeling paint, a shutter hanging from a single hinge, the dark, vacant windows like eyes. To the left, the massive, hulking shape of a barn stood, its roof sagging in the middle like a broken spine. It was a place steeped in neglect, yet it had a strange, heartbreaking beauty. It had good bones. I climbed the porch steps, which groaned in protest. I stood before the heavy wooden door. My hand was shaking as I pulled the old iron key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a grating sound. I turned it. For a moment, nothing happened. It was frozen solid. I put my shoulder against the door and pushed with all my might. With a deep, shuddering groan of wood and rusted metal, the door swung inward, opening into a chasm of perfect blackness. A wave of air rolled out to meet me. It was the smell of a place that had been holding its breath for a very, very long time. The smell of cold stone, dry rot, dust, and the faintest ghostly trace of wood smoke from a fire lit 40 years ago. I stepped across the threshold, pulling my luggage in behind me. I had come home. I closed the heavy door behind me, and the world outside vanished. I was plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like a physical substance. My heart hammered against my ribs. For a moment, I was paralyzed by a primal fear of the unseen. I fumbled in my tote bag for the small, cheap flashlight I'd packed, my fingers clumsy with cold. I found the switch, and a weak, yellowish beam cut through the gloom. I was standing in a wide, central hallway. To my left and right, doorways gaped like open mouths. Straight ahead, a grand staircase ascended into the shadows of the second floor. Everything, absolutely everything, was covered in a thick, uniform layer of gray dust. It softened every edge, muted every surface. Directly in front of me, a long runner carpet was just a faint pattern beneath the dust. I aimed the flashlight to my left into what looked like a living room. The shapes of furniture stood like shrouded figures, all draped in white canvas sheets. A sofa, 2 armchairs, a grand fireplace with a dark, yawning mouth. It was a tableau of suspended life, a room waiting for an intermission that had never ended. I moved the beam to the right. A dining room. A long table and chairs, also under sheets. A heavy sideboard stood against the far wall. The air was utterly still, the silence so profound I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I took a tentative step forward, my shoes scuffing on the dusty floorboards. The sound was a desecration. I felt like an intruder, a grave robber. But this was my grave to rob. It was my history, buried under layers of dust and time. I walked into the living room, my flashlight beam dancing across the shrouded forms. I reached out and lifted the corner of a sheet covering an armchair. The fabric underneath was a faded floral chintz, surprisingly well preserved. I ran my hand over it. It was cold, but it was real. I imagined my mother choosing this fabric, thinking it was cheerful. I moved through the downstairs rooms like a ghost myself. The dining room, a small study with a huge, imposing desk, and finally, the kitchen at the back of the house. The kitchen was the most haunting place of all. It was a time capsule from the 1950s. A big, white enamel sink, a hulking refrigerator with a latch handle, a stove that looked like a small tank. On a hook by the back door, a faded apron still hung, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment. I touched it. The fabric was brittle, but it held its shape. Had this been my mother's? Had she stood at this sink, looking out the window at the fields, with me sleeping in a cradle upstairs? The thought was so powerful, so vivid, it made me dizzy. The house was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that went right to the bone. Colder inside than out. But my task for the night was not to find warmth, it was to find answers. The lawyer had mentioned a trust. My mother had been meticulous. She wouldn't have left the story to chance. There had to be something here. A letter, a journal, something. My instincts led me back to the study. The desk was the centerpiece of the room, a heavy oak monolith that seemed to command the space even from beneath its canvas shroud. I pulled the sheet off. The wood was dark and rich, covered in a layer of dust but otherwise unharmed. I ran my flashlight over its surface. It had several drawers. I tried the top left one. It was locked. I tried the others, all locked. Of course. My mother had been a protector of secrets. I looked around the room. There had to be a key. I checked under the desk blotter, a rectangle of ancient, cracked leather. Nothing. I ran my hands along the sides and back of the desk, searching for a hidden latch or a taped-on key. Nothing. I sat down in the desk chair, which creaked alarmingly under my weight. I shone the light on the locked center drawer. Frustration and exhaustion washed over me. What had I been thinking, coming here? It was a fool's errand. I was going to freeze to death in my own inheritance. I rested my forehead in my hands, the cold metal of the flashlight pressing against my skin. And then I saw it. Not with my eyes, but with my memory. A flash of my mother at her little secretary desk in our city apartment. She needed a paperclip and couldn't find one. She'd gotten frustrated and then laughed, tapping the side of a small wooden box. "Everything has its secret place," she'd said. I stood up and examined the desk again, not as a piece of furniture, but as a puzzle. I looked at the ornate carvings on the legs, the trim around the drawers. On the right-hand pedestal, just below the desktop, was a small, carved wooden rosette. It looked purely decorative, but on a hunch, I pressed it. Nothing happened. I tried to turn it. It wouldn't budge. Then I pushed it inward, hard. There was a faint click. A narrow, vertical panel on the side of the pedestal popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. And inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, brass key. My breath hitched. With trembling fingers, I took the key and inserted it into the lock of the center drawer. It turned with a satisfying, solid clunk. I pulled the drawer open. It was not full of papers as I had expected. It was almost empty. It contained only one thing: a heavy, dark green metal box, the kind used for cash or important documents. It was not locked. I lifted it out and placed it on the dusty surface of the desk. It was surprisingly heavy. This was it. This had to be it. I took a deep breath, like a diver about to plunge into deep water, and I lifted the lid. The contents of the metal box were not what I expected. There was no stack of cash, no deed, no bonds. There was only paper, but it was personal. On top lay a bundle of letters, at least a dozen of them, tied together with a pale blue ribbon that had faded almost to white. The handwriting on the top envelope was instantly, painfully familiar. It was my mother's elegant, looping script. It was addressed to me. For my Alara. Beneath the letters was a small, worn, black velvet pouch, closed with a drawstring. And under that, a single, official-looking document. I picked up the pouch first. It was soft and surprisingly heavy for its size. I loosened the drawstring and tipped its contents into my palm. A single gold coin fell out, landing with a soft, heavy thud. It was old, the image on it worn smooth with time. It gleamed dully in my flashlight beam. Tucked into the pouch was a tiny, folded piece of paper. I carefully unfolded it, the same handwriting. "This was your grandmother's, all I had left of her. It's not much, but it's a start. Always bet on yourself, my love." I closed my hand around the coin, its weight and warmth a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of the last few days. I didn't know my grandmother, she had died before I was born. This coin was my only connection to a woman I'd never met. I gently placed it on the desk and turned my attention to the letters. I untied the ribbon, which felt as fragile as a butterfly's wing. The top letter was thicker than the rest. I pulled it from its envelope. The date at the top read October 12th, 1955. I would have been 5 years old. "My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has forced my hand. I am so sorry. I am sorry for the secrets, and I am sorry for the life of struggle I have likely given you. Please, before you judge me, let me explain. This farm, this house you are in, was meant to be our sanctuary. It was meant to be your home. I bought it with money my mother left me, a secret inheritance I never told a soul about. I bought it the year you were born, as a promise to you. A promise of a life with clean air, green grass, and safety. A life far away from him. I know the story I have always told you. That your father was a good man, a soldier who died a hero's death overseas. Alara, my sweet girl, that was a lie. It was a lie I told to protect you and to protect myself. Your father, his name was Thomas, was not a hero. He was charming, handsome, and when I met him, I believed he was the world. But there was a darkness in him, a violence that he hid behind a quick smile. He was involved with dangerous men, in business that was not clean. When I found out I was pregnant with you, I was overjoyed. But he was not. You were not part of his plan. You were an inconvenience. The argument started, then the violence. One night, he hurt me badly. As I lay on the floor of our tiny apartment, I knew I could not bring a child, my child, into that world. So I ran. I took the money my mother had left me, the money I had been saving, and I disappeared. I bought this farm under my maiden name, Iris Vance, and I prepared to build a life for us here. But he was looking for me. His associates were looking for me. They were not men who gave up easily. I realized that even here, we would never be truly safe as long as he knew we existed. So I ran again. I went to the city, to a place so big and anonymous I hoped we could disappear. I changed our story. I became a widow. You became the daughter of a fallen hero. I lived in poverty, always looking over my shoulder, because poverty made us invisible. This farm became my secret weapon, my one great hope. I paid the taxes on it for as long as I could, through a lawyer, Mr. Finch, a man I trusted completely. It was our insurance policy. A real home, waiting for the day it was safe to claim it. I never told you, my love, because to know of it was to be in danger. If he ever found us, he could have used it against us, taken it from us. Your ignorance was your armor. My silence was my shield. I am writing this now because I am sick. The doctor says it's my lungs. I don't have much time. I have arranged for the farm to be held in trust, to lie sleeping until the day you might need it. I hope you never do. I hope you live a long, happy life, and never have cause to read these words. But I fear the world is not so kind. If you are here, it is because you are in need. This house, this land, it is all I have to give you. It is the real story of my love for you. It is not a story of weakness or failure, but a story of a mother's fight to save her child. Do with it what you will. Sell it and find comfort, or stay, and let it be the home I always dreamed for you. The choice is yours. All I ask is that you know the truth. You were not abandoned. You were protected. You were, and always will be, the entire purpose of my life. All my love, forever, Mama. I read the last words through a blur of tears. The letter fell from my hands onto the desk. A sound escaped my throat, a ragged, wounded sob that tore through the house's deep silence. The cold, the dust, the darkness, none of it mattered. The room was filled with the overwhelming presence of my mother. Her love, her fear, her sacrifice. My whole life, I had carried a picture of her as a gentle, somewhat tragic figure. A woman defeated by life. And in one single letter, that picture had been shattered and replaced by the image of a warrior. A fierce, cunning strategist who had played a long, desperate game to keep me safe. I cried. I cried for the mother I never truly knew. I cried for the years of poverty and struggle she endured for my sake. I cried for the life we could have had in this house, a life of sunshine and safety that was stolen from us. I cried for the little girl who had believed her father was a hero, and for the old woman who now knew he was a monster. The tears were hot on my cold face, a flood of grief and rage and a profound, bottomless love. My entire past had been a lie, but it was a lie forged from the purest truth. I was not the daughter of a weak woman. I was the daughter of a quiet hero. And this farm was not a random inheritance. It was a fortress she had built for me, stone by stone, secret by secret. I sat there in the dark, in the profound cold of my mother's house, and for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel alone. The grief came in waves, each one colder and more powerful than the last. I picked up the other letters. They were not as long. They were more like journal entries, written over the years and sent to Mr. Finch to be held. One described her fear in the city, how she saw a man on the street who looked like my father and had to hide in a shop for an hour, her heart pounding. Another, from when I was a teenager, spoke of her pride in my good grades and her sorrow that she couldn't give me the pretty dresses and carefree youth the other girls had. She wrote about her dreams, vivid dreams where we were both here, on the farm, planting a garden. I can almost smell the tomato plants, she wrote, and feel the sun on my face. Ilara is laughing. It's the only place I ever hear her laugh anymore. Each letter was a small, sharp piece of glass, reflecting a piece of her hidden heart. The story they told was one of constant, grinding fear, of looking over her shoulder her entire life. But it was also a story of fierce, unwavering love. A love so strong it had reached across 40 years of silence to find me in this cold, dark room. The weight of it was crushing. The entire narrative of my life had been a carefully constructed fiction, and the author was the one person I thought I knew. I had loved her, of course, but I had also pitied her. I had seen her as fragile. The truth was, she was the strongest person I had ever known. Stronger than the system that had just discarded me. Stronger than the poverty that had defined our lives. Stronger than the man who had tried to break her. An anger began to smolder beneath my grief. An anger at my father, this ghost who had haunted our lives without my even knowing it. An anger at the circumstances that had forced her into a life of hiding. And a slow, simmering anger at the Northwood Development Group with their clean, crisp offer. They didn't see a sanctuary. They saw undeveloped land. They saw profit. Selling this place now felt like a betrayal. It felt like taking my mother's life's work, her fortress of love, and selling it for scrap. But what was the alternative? The $34,000 question. I was 74. I had less than $20 to my name. I was standing in a house with no heat, no electricity, no running water. The roof of the barn was caving in. The fields were overgrown. Keeping it was not a matter of sentiment, it was a matter of logistics, and every single logistic was impossible. The sensible choice was still the same. Take the money. Find a small, quiet apartment. Live out my remaining years in peace. My mother's own letter had given me permission. Do with it what you will. Sell it and find comfort. She would understand. But would I? Could I cash in her sacrifice for a few years of sterile comfort in a place that would never be home? Could I live with myself, knowing I had let her fortress fall? I picked up the gold coin from the desk. It felt heavy in my palm. Always bet on yourself, her note had said. It was a strange thing for a woman who had spent her life hiding to write. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe betting on herself was exactly what she had done. She had bet that she could escape. She had bet that she could keep me safe. She had bet that this farm would survive the decades and be here for me if I needed it. She had won every one of those bets. Now it was my turn to place a bet. I leaned my head back against the dusty chair, the flashlight beam pointing at the ceiling, showing the faint water stains in the corner. I felt utterly lost, caught between a past I had never known and a future I couldn't imagine. It was here, in the depths of that cold and confusion, that I felt the need to speak to someone, even if it was just the empty air. Have you ever discovered a secret that changed how you saw your entire life? A truth that lands with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of you and leaving you gasping. It's a feeling that can either break you or remake you. It rearranges all the furniture in your soul, and you're left standing in the middle of it all, wondering how you're ever going to make sense of the new layout. If you're finding a piece of your own story in this, if you've ever had the ground shift beneath your feet, I want you to know you're not alone. We're going to get through this part together. Stick with me. I sat there for what felt like hours, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The flashlight began to flicker, its yellow beam weakening. Soon, I would be in total darkness again. The cold was no longer just in the air. It was in my bones, a deep, cellular chill. Despair was a tempting blanket. It would be so easy to just give up. To huddle here until morning, then walk into town and call Mr. Finch and tell him to sell. It would be an end to the struggle. But then I thought of my mother, alone in the city, sick, writing these letters by the light of a cheap lamp. She hadn't given up. Even when she knew she was dying, she was still fighting for me, still planning, still protecting. Her fight hadn't ended with her last breath. It had been passed to me in a green metal box. The flashlight gave one last pathetic flicker and died. The absolute darkness returned. But this time, it felt different. It was no longer menacing. It felt peaceful. It was the quiet of my mother's house holding me. And in that quiet, a decision began to form. I don't know if I slept. I think I drifted in and out of a state that was neither waking nor dreaming, a cold, gray limbo. My thoughts circled endlessly around my mother's letters and the impossible choice before me. I saw her face, young and determined. I saw the sterile corridor of golden pastures. I saw the developer's offer, a neat stack of bills that felt like blood money. When the first hint of dawn began to gray the edges of the dusty windows, it was a profound relief. The world was returning. I got up, my joints screaming in protest from the cold and the stiff chair. I was stiff, hungry, and exhausted, but I was also filled with a strange, nervous energy. I walked to the kitchen and looked out the window over the sink. The view that had been a black void was now a landscape of breathtaking beauty. A wide, sloping field, covered in a blanket of pristine snow, rolled down to a line of dark pine trees. The rising sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of pale pink and gold, and the light was catching the frost on every tree branch, making them glitter like they were strung with diamonds. This was what my mother had seen. This was the view she had bought for us. It was a view of peace, of space, of freedom. And in that moment, watching the sun climb over the horizon of my own land, something inside me shifted. The last vestiges of fear and doubt were burned away by the morning light. The choice was no longer a choice. It was a calling. I felt a sudden, urgent need to make warmth, to bring this house back to life, even in the smallest way. I remembered the fireplace in the living room. There had to be wood. I put on my thin coat and gloves and went out the back door. The cold was sharp, but the sun was on my face. Behind the house, tucked under a lean-to, was a woodshed, and inside, miraculously, was a stack of firewood, old and silvered with age, but dry. It was covered in cobwebs and dust, but it was there. My mother, or whoever she had hired, had prepared for a winter that never came. I carried an armload of it back inside, my muscles straining. It took me 3 trips. I knelt before the huge stone fireplace in the living room. I had never built a fire in my life. I had lived in apartments with radiators, then in a facility with central heating. But I had read books. I crumpled up the junk mail I still had in my tote bag. The walk-in tub advertisement felt like a fitting sacrifice, and laid the kindling on top. I arranged the larger logs as I had seen in pictures. The last piece of the puzzle was fire itself. I didn't have matches. My heart sank. It was such a small, stupid detail to be defeated by. I rummaged through my bag again, my search growing more frantic. And then my fingers brushed against something small and hard in a side pocket. A disposable lighter. I had no memory of putting it there. Maybe it had been there for years. It didn't matter. It was there. I flicked the wheel. A tiny flame sparked to life, a small, brave miracle in the vast cold. I held the flame to the crumpled paper. It caught, blackened, and then a cheerful orange tongue of fire began to lick at the kindling. For a few tense moments, it seemed like it would die, but then the kindling caught and the flames grew, reaching up and embracing the larger logs. A soft, crackling sound filled the silence, and then, for the first time in 40 years, there was warmth in Blackwood Farm. I sat on the dusty floor, as close to the fire as I dared, and held my hands out to it. The heat felt like a blessing. It was a small victory, but it was everything. It was proof that I could do something, that I could fight back against the cold, that I could bring life back to this place. I watched the flames dance, and I knew what I had to do. I went back to the study, my movements sure and purposeful now. I found my cheap cell phone in my bag. The battery was critically low, a single red bar blinking at me. I had one call to make. I dialed the number for Finch and Associates. He answered on the second ring, his voice as calm and steady as ever. "Alistair Finch." "Mr. Finch, it's Alara Vance." "Ms. Vance, are you all right? Where are you?" There was a genuine note of concern in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I'm at the farm," I said. The fire crackled in the next room, and for the first time, it felt true. I was at the farm. "I've made my decision." "You'll be accepting the offer then," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the only logical conclusion. "No," I said, my voice clear and strong, echoing in the quiet room. "I'm not selling. Tell the developers their offer is rejected. This farm is not for sale." There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing. I imagined him sitting in his warm, orderly office, my file open on his desk, completely taken by surprise. "Ms. Vance," he said finally, his voice different now. The professional veneer had cracked. "Alara, are you certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I said. "This is my home. My mother saved it for me. Now, I'm going to save it for her." Another pause. Then he said, "All right, let's get to work. Tell me exactly what you need." The red bar on my phone blinked out, and the line went dead. But it didn't matter. The connection had been made. The fight had begun. The aftermath of my decision was not a sudden cinematic transformation. It was a slow, grinding, day-by-day battle against time, poverty, and entropy. My conversation with Mr. Finch had set the legal wheels in motion, but the practical reality was me, alone in a freezing house, with a dying fire and a rumbling stomach. My first priority was survival. I walked the 2 miles into the town of North Haven. It was even smaller than it had looked on the map. Little more than a crossroads with a church, a town hall, a post office, and a single general store with a gas pump out front. The sign read, "Mary's." I pushed open the door, and a little bell jingled. The warmth and the smell of coffee and bacon were overwhelming. A woman with short gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" she asked. "George, the taxi driver, sent me," I said. "He said to ask for Mary." A smile touched her lips. "George said that, did he? Then you must be the one who's moved into the old Iris place. I'm Mary. Coffee's fresh." I used the money George had given me to buy a coffee and a sandwich. I also bought a box of matches, a can of soup, and a loaf of bread. As Mary rang me up, she looked at me with open curiosity. "So you're Iris's girl," she said. "We all wondered what happened. Heard the developers were sniffing around." "I'm not selling," I said, more forcefully than I intended. Mary raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something, respect maybe, in her eyes. "Good for you," she said simply. "It's a good piece of land. Shame to see it turned into condos for flatlanders." That small exchange was the first crack of light in my profound isolation. I wasn't just a crazy old woman in a derelict house. I was Iris's girl. I had a place in the town's story. The next challenge was the money. The $34,000 for the taxes loomed like a mountain. Mr. Finch was working on a hardship extension, but it was a temporary measure. the bill would come due. I remembered the gold coin. The next day, I took it to a neighboring town that had a small jewelry and antique shop. The owner was a stooped man with a jeweler's loop permanently attached to his eye. He examined the coin with a professional skepticism, weighing it, studying it. "It's an old one," he grunted. "Austrian ducat. Not especially rare, but it's solid gold." He named a price. It was more than I had dared to hope for. $1,800. It wasn't 34,000, but it wasn't nothing. It was enough to file the extension, pay Mr. Finch a small retainer, and buy real groceries. It was enough to keep the fight going. I deposited the money and began the slow work of reclaiming the house. I started with one room, the kitchen. I spent a full day scrubbing. I found the water main in the cellar and, with a Herculean effort, managed to turn it on. I was terrified a pipe would burst, but the only sound was a groan and then the glorious gurgle of water filling the system. I turned on the tap at the kitchen sink, and after a sputtering fit of rust and air, clear, cold water poured out. I cupped my hands and drank. It was the sweetest water I had ever tasted. News of my presence spread through the town with the speed of gossip in a small community. People were curious. One afternoon, George the taxi driver pulled up the driveway, which I had started to clear with a rusty shovel I found in the barn. His pickup truck rattled to a stop. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing me a large thermos of hot soup and a bag of groceries. "My wife Sarah made too much." I knew he was lying, but I was too grateful to argue. I invited him in, and he stood in the doorway of my half-clean kitchen, looking around in wonder. "Haven't been in this house since I was a boy," he said. "My dad used to help Iris with the fences. She was a nice lady. Quiet. Always seemed a little sad." He saw the broken shovel I was using. The next morning, he returned with his son, a young man in his 20s, and a gas-powered snowblower. In an hour, they cleared the entire driveway. "Just being neighborly," George said, waving off my thanks. That small act of kindness was the turning point. It was no longer just my fight. Others started to appear. A neighbor from down the road, a retired carpenter named Ben, stopped by and spent an afternoon securing the loose shutter and patching a hole in the porch roof. Mary, from the general store, started setting aside the day-old bread for me. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, quiet acts of community, threads of connection being woven around me. The work was brutal. I cleaned and scrubbed and sorted. I threw out mountains of trash, things ruined by damp and time. But I also found treasures. A box of my old school reports, a tiny pair of my baby shoes, a photograph of my mother, smiling, standing on the front porch of this very house, a brief moment of hope captured on film before she fled. Each discovery was a fresh wound and a fresh balm. I was excavating my own life, piecing together the woman my mother was, and in doing so, discovering the woman I was becoming. The snows of winter slowly gave way to the mud of spring. The world around the farmhouse began to thaw, and with the melting snow, a new landscape was revealed. The fields were a tangle of brown, matted grass, but here and there, the first green shoots of crocuses and daffodils my mother must have planted were pushing their way through the cold earth. They were a quiet testament to her hope, a splash of color against the gray backdrop of neglect. Life was returning to Blackwood Farm, and to me. My days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and my own aching muscles. I woke at dawn, started a fire in the kitchen's newly cleaned wood stove, and ate a simple breakfast while watching the lights spread across the valley. The physical labor was relentless. I cleared brush. I washed windows that hadn't seen the sun in decades. I repaired what I could and made lists of what I couldn't. I was tired every night in a way I hadn't been in years. It wasn't the weary fatigue of boredom and waiting that I had known at Golden Pastures. It was the deep, satisfying exhaustion that comes from meaningful work. I was stronger. My hands, once soft and idle, were now calloused and capable. The slight stoop in my shoulders was gone, replaced by the straight posture of someone with a purpose. I had a weekly call with Mr. Finch. He had become more than a lawyer, he was a confidant, a strategist. He successfully negotiated a payment plan for the back taxes, citing my age, my financial situation, and my commitment to restoring the property. The town council, influenced by the quiet support of people like George and Mary, had agreed. The mountain of debt was now a series of manageable hills. It would take me years to pay it off, but it was possible. One afternoon, while clearing out the sagging barn, I found a corner filled with old gardening tools. A rusted hoe, a spade with a cracked handle, and a wheelbarrow with a flat tire. And underneath them, a wooden crate full of old seed packets from the 1950s. Most were surely useless, the life within them long gone. But I also found a collection of glass jars filled with saved seeds, beans, squash, and tomatoes, each labeled in my mother's careful script. I took a handful of the bean seeds. They were old and shriveled, but I decided to try. I found a sunny patch of ground near the house where the soil seemed dark and rich. I spent a day turning the earth with the old spade, my back protesting with every movement. I broke up the clumps of dirt with my hands, pulling out rocks and weeds. I felt a connection to the land that was visceral, primal. This wasn't just dirt, it was my mother's dirt. It was the soil she had dreamed of planting. I laid the old seeds in the shallow furrows and covered them up. I watered them from the kitchen tap using an old bucket. It felt like a foolish act of faith, but faith was all I had. I began to think about the meaning of home. For so long, home had been a place of walls and a roof, a container for a life. Golden pastures had been a place to stay. This farm was a place to be. It was not just property. It wasn't an asset to be liquidated. It was a living story. It was the final chapter of my mother's life and the first chapter of my own. I had arrived here as a refugee from my own life, a displaced person. But in fighting for this land, I was putting down roots. I was no longer Ilara Vance, the elderly woman who slipped through the cracks. I was Ilara Vance, the woman of Blackwood Farm. I was Iris's daughter. My age, which had felt like a liability, a final chapter of decline, now felt like an asset. I had a lifetime of quiet observation, of patience, of knowing what was truly important. At 74, I had been told my story was over, but I was just beginning to write it. One evening, I was sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky. Ben, the retired carpenter, drove up. He didn't say much, just got out of his truck and started unloading lumber. "Figured I'd replace these porch steps for you before you break your neck on them," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I tried to offer him the little money I had. He just waved it away. "Let's just call it an investment in the neighborhood," he said with a small smile. I watched him work, the clean sound of his saw and the rhythmic tap of his hammer echoing in the evening air. It was the sound of rebuilding, the sound of hope. And I realized my mother hadn't just left me a house and some land. She had left me a purpose. She hadn't just given me an inheritance, she had given me back my life. I am sitting on the new front porch of the farmhouse. The steps no longer groan. The railing is solid under my hand. The paint is still peeling in places, and the barn still sags, a project for another year, but the house feels solid. It feels alive. It is summer now, and the air is warm and sweet with the smell of cut grass and blooming honeysuckle. In front of the porch, where there was only mud and tangled weeds, there is now a small, thriving garden. The bean seeds, the ones from my mother's jars, had sprouted. They grew into strong, vibrant plants that have climbed the trellises Ben built for me. I have squash and zucchini, and the tomato plants are heavy with green fruit that is just beginning to blush with red. It's not a big garden. It's not a commercial enterprise. It's a garden for one, but it feels like the most profound success of my life. I have put my own hands into the soil my mother saved for me. I have nurtured the life she stored away, and it has flourished. My days are still long and full of work, but it is joyful work. I have paid the first 3 installments on my tax plan. I sell a few vegetables at a small stand at the end of my driveway. Mary buys my tomatoes for her store. It's not much, but it's mine. I am not just surviving, I am building. The house is no longer a museum of my mother's past. It is my home. I have kept her furniture, but I have cleaned it, repaired it, and arranged it to fit my life. I eat my meals at the big dining room table, no longer shrouded in a white sheet. I read in the evenings by the fire, in the floral chintz armchair. I have brought this place back into the present. Sometimes I think about the other path. The $60,000. The small, clean apartment. A life of quiet, comfortable waiting. And I feel a profound sense of gratitude that I was foolish enough, or brave enough, to choose this. To choose the hard, beautiful, meaningful work of reclamation. This farm was my mother's last letter to me, written in wood and stone and soil. And my life here is my answer to her. It says, I understand. Thank you. Your sacrifice was not in vain. It says, I am home. Second chances don't always arrive looking like a gift. Sometimes they look like a burden. They look like a dilapidated farmhouse, a mountain of debt, a task so overwhelming it seems impossible. Sometimes the greatest opportunities are disguised as the hardest work. But what this story taught me, what my mother taught me, is that the things worth saving are rarely the things that are easy. The real inheritance was never the property, it was the story that came with it. It was the truth of my mother's love and the chance to finally understand my own past and choose my own future. Maybe you have a farm in your life, something that looks broken or impossible, something the world tells you to give up on. A dream you've set aside, a relationship that needs mending, a part of yourself you've been told is not worth the effort. What I've learned is that the value of a thing is not in its market price, but in the love and sacrifice that has been poured into it. Those are the things worth fighting for. Those are the things that make a life. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you a little bit of hope, or made you feel a little less alone in your own struggle, please consider subscribing to the channel. We believe in the power of these stories, in their ability to remind us of our own strength. And now, I want you to do me a favor. In the comments below, don't just tell me what you thought of the story. Tell me about a time you chose the harder right over the easier wrong. Tell me about your farm. I'll be reading every single one of your stories. Because your story matters. Your fight matters. Thank you for being here with me today.